There are a few different ways that you can create primitives in MODO, so let's talk about how we do that and the concept of mesh items in MODO. Here we are again in the Model tab, and the first thing I want you to notice before we create anything is over here under the Item tab you can see all the items we currently have in our MODO scene. By default we have a mesh item, a camera, and a directional light. And currently this mesh item is empty, and we can tell that it's empty because it's grayed out. And we can actually rename that mesh item if we want. Let's do that now. Call it my new mesh. And again, this is an empty mesh item, and that just means that it doesn't contain any geometry. And that's really all a mesh item is a container for geometry. A mesh item is just one object or mesh made out of whatever geometry you choose. Now let's jump over to Max and make a few boxes to illustrate the differences between Max and MODO in this regard. So I'm going to select the box primitive, just drag out a few boxes here, like so. And you'll notice over here in the Scene Explorer that I have 4 individual box objects. Now let's jump back over to MODO. And we'll do the same thing. With our mesh item selected, let's just select the cube primitive and start dragging out some boxes. Okay, now we have 3 boxes. Oops. Now we have 3 boxes. And let's make another box, but this time let's hold down the Control key. And you'll see when I do that, that we get these little measurement tick marks here on the icons of the primitives. And if I click the cube primitive, we'll get what's called a unit cube. And that's just a cube that's 1 meter square on all sides. And I'll make a couple of other primitives. Let's just do a cylinder and a sphere. All right. Now notice that we still only have one mesh item. We've just been creating our primitives inside our single mesh item container, and they'll be treated as one object. To further illustrate this, let's make sure we're in item mode and select the transform tool and just move our mesh around. And you can see that indeed it does move as one item. And that's because it's a single mesh item. We don't have to attach the primitives together or anything since they all live together in this single mesh item. And let's just move that out of the way a little bit. And hit the spacebar to drop the transform tool. Now, what if we want to make each box a separate item like what happens in Max? Well, we need to make them each a separate mesh item. And we can easily do that a couple of different ways. We can go to the Geometry menu and just select New Mesh Item. And then when I go in and drag out a box, it's in its own new mesh item. I can also just hit the N on the keyboard, and this will also create a new mesh item, a new empty mesh item. And now I can go in and drag out a new primitive, and it will be in its own mesh item. I can also just right-click and select the primitive that I want. And when I select it, it will create a unit primitive as its own mesh item. Let's move him out of the way. Drop the tool. I can also go to the Geometry tab and say Unit Primitives in New Mesh and select the one I want, like so. And let's move that guy out of the way too. Lastly, we can hold down the Shift key and you'll see that we get these little plus signs on the primitive icons. And if I click on it, I get another unit primitive in its own mesh item. So hopefully you can see the importance of creating a new mesh item when you want a new individual object. Before we move on, let's quickly look at a few other things to note when creating primitives in MODO. Let's just delete a few of these mesh items here. Actually, let's delete them all. And I'll just hit N to create a new empty mesh item. Now, if I select one of these primitives over here, you'll notice that I get all of the properties for that primitive before I even start dragging anything out in the viewport. And I can go in here and just make it whatever dimensions I want. And as soon as I have the dimensions I want, I can hit the apply button, and that's what I'll get when the primitive gets created. Another thing to note is that when I create a primitive, just Let's drag out this cylinder here. With the tool still active, I can hold down the right mouse button and drag it left and right and forward and back to change the number of segments in my primitive. And that's pretty handy for creating segmented primitives. One other nice shortcut when creating primitives is to just go select the primitive you want, and you can just right-click in the viewport. You'll get a unit primitive, but the tool handles will be active, and you can instantly go in and modify the primitive to your liking. Now that we've seen how to create some primitives, let's take a look at MODO's component geometry modes.